Good afternoon again. I have looked forward to today for several weeks, and I am delighted to be able to present to our First Friday Club Dr. Brenna Moore, a theology professor from Fordham University. Brenna is a specialist in the area of modern Christianity with a focus on Catholic intellectual and cultural history in Europe. She is really particularly interested in questions concerning women, gender, and religion, mysticism, mysticism and spirituality, and a movement known in theology as Ressourcement and the various Catholic responses to modernity. Dr. Moore, most recently, is the author of Mutuality in El Barrio, Stories of the Little Sisters of the Assumption Family Health Service. She's also the author of Sacred Dread, Raïssa Maritain, The Allure of Suffering and the French Catholic Revival. At Fordham, Dr. Moore teaches introductory courses in theology, seminars for majors, and graduate courses. She is so very talented, and it's with great pleasure that I present to you Dr. Brenna Moore.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Anne, for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for welcoming me here in Youngstown. I'm visiting from New York. I teach at Fordham University in the Bronx, but it's great to be in Youngstown because my father's entire side of the family is all from Youngstown. He went to elementary school at St. Charles. I have two sets of great-grandparents, great-aunts, great-uncles, the Moores and the Radigans, buried at Calvary Cemetery. And I can't resist but share this story. So I'm staying at the Ursuline Mother House, and I was introduced this morning to Sister Norma, and I was just telling her about my dad's roots, and she said, "What's his name?" And I said, "Tim Moore." And she said, "He's one of my brother's best childhood friends, Marty Roppel." And I said, "I've heard about Marty all my life. I know that they're still in touch." So she called Marty, and he drove over just this right then. You know, this was just this morning. And we took a picture and sent it to my dad. And they were in Cub Scouts together and are still friends. And it was such a special conversation and a special connection. And I've just been blown away by the small town feel of Youngstown. And I know my dad holds Youngstown so dear in his heart. And I just think that says something so special about your community, that he's still friends with a group of people in 8th grade that he was. Tim Porter, I've met many times. You know, I just think that it wouldn't happen in a lot of places in the country. I just think that's really cool. And the fact that this lunch is happening, that's mostly I think all volunteer-led. I mean, what a wonderful, rich civil society. So it's just really special, so special to be here. And thank you to the volunteers who put this together. Thanks especially to Anne, to both Annes who are hosting me and welcome me, and to Ray and Courtney who help with the logistics. Mary Ellen and her husband picked me up from the airport. So I'm just so grateful for all this generosity and warmth and welcome, and for the invitation. So, and thank you, of course, all of you for spending your Thursday afternoon with us. And so it's great to be here. So I'll go ahead and get started. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about the tradition of spiritual friendship in modern Catholicism. And I'll suggest some ways that a particular history of Catholic spiritual friendship in the 20th century offers a kind of counter way of being in the world, and not just at the level of our personal lives, which is where we kind of think friendship makes a difference in our personal lives, But in my research, I learned that this tradition of spiritual friendship had larger implications on society, politics, and spirituality. This is kind of a buried Catholic history that I uncovered for my second book called Kindred Spirits, Friendship and Resistance at the Edges of Modern Catholicism. I didn't bring any books because I flew and just had to carry on, but you can get it on Amazon, Kindred Spirits. This is where this research comes from that. When it comes to this topic of spiritual friendship, and by that I mean this idea that friends are crucial partners on the spiritual journey, crucial partners on the pathway to God. So that tradition of spiritual friendship, there are many fabulous studies about this when it comes to the history of Catholicism from the medieval and early modern period. So if any of you are interested, there's a scholar named Brian Patrick McGuire. He has a book on friendship and faith on the Cistercian medieval ideas of friendship. Alan Bray has an incredible book called The Friend that explores the topic of spiritual friendship from the 11th to the 19th century. And he gives a very graphic image of spiritual friendship of priests who had been very close friends in life and wanted to lie together in death and share a grave, John Henry Newman and his friend John of St. Ambrose. But among the historians of Christianity, there's this widespread sense of like, yes, the church had this robust history, the practice of spiritual friendship in our early period, but in modernity, it kind of cooled off. That in modernity, the 19th, 20th century, the church placed greater emphasis on useful service to the world, universal love, universal charity, and these kind of special, exclusive spiritual friendships were kind of downgraded, you know, and for this emphasis on universal love and charity. So the idea was that this kind of faded from the scene. You don't get much of that. But the stories that I'll share with you today totally challenge this narrative and show that spiritual friendship in the church did not disappear as a theology, as a practice, as a way of living in the world. It didn't disappear in the 19th and 20th century, but it was very much revitalized again by mid-20th century Catholics who were very inspired by medieval and monastic models of friendship for spiritual, social, even political rejuvenation. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I found in that research, and then ultimately I want to point to ways that the traditions of Catholic spiritual friendship speak to some contemporary concerns of all of us in the United States. And I'm thinking of what the U.S. Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, he called in a 2023 publication, "Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation." So these buried Catholic histories of spiritual friendship offer, I think, alternatives to our culture that is both kind of pushing and pulling us towards levels of aloneness that we are totally not designed for, you know, or prepared for. But before I get into the details of spiritual friendship, I want to just show you a little bit about this world. So my area of research is mostly focused on the Catholic theologians, writers, poets, thinkers, who worked in Europe in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And they were the really creative thinkers that helped pave the way for the changes inaugurated by Vatican II. So they were kind of the theologians who helped make all that happen. I did my dissertation and my first book was on this woman, Raïssa Maritain, who was the wife of a famous Catholic philosopher named Jacques Maritain, a name that might be familiar to some of you. She was a poet and a mystic. He was a philosopher, and he was active actually in helping to draft the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And as I got into their biography, their spirituality, their writing, especially her, I came to see that friendship was by far the total center of gravity of their lives. So here is an example of some things that I found in Raïssa Maritain's archive, located just outside of Strasbourg in France. So they recreated her study, and that is her study on the far left, and you can't quite see it, they're small, but they're portraits of saints, popes, different holy figures mixed in with different photographs of her friends. And it was just had this atmosphere of kind of a visual rendering of her friendships that was absolutely in kind of a sacred atmosphere. She had another another medallion made out of one of her friends. And I found in reading a lot of her correspondence and their letters, you know, in archives, you kind of open up a folder to put your hands on the real letter, and often little tactile spiritual objects would fall out. So, you know, just letters friends would write each other, they would tuck into it little, you know, medals, medallions, little sacred objects, and absolutely the paper correspondence were sacred objects, without a doubt. And she titled her memoir, Les Grandes Amitiés, which is the great friendships. So she used friendships for the story of her whole life. And even I noticed in the writing of friendship, often friendship among this Catholic community was written, just the word friend or friendship was often in a capital, like it's amitié in French, so it's a capital A. So people would write about friendship with a capital letter, along with, like, you know, the capital letter for God, or even sometimes love, as if they were really raising up friendships to the height of the sacred. And I think over the course of many years of research, I came to see, you know, for my next project, that the Maritains were not unique. That in this period of incredible Catholic creativity, friendship was the fuel that energized the entire thing. So these are different archives from a Catholic poet from Chile, Gabriela Mistral, who I've written on, an African-American Catholic poet, Claude McKay, who was a friend of Dorothy Day's, and this is Jacques and Raïssa Maritain. But there was always these holy cards, letters, and friendship, you know, and correspondences to one another. People sometimes at conferences and talks like this would have maybe an aunt or an uncle or a great-grandparent who was friends with some of these people, and they had, you know, a portrait, a picture, and sometimes they would give them to me. I have these objects in my office because, you know, these aren't spiritual friends of living people right now, but people know that for someone sometime, these objects and images access the grace of these departed people. So I began to learn that this really is at the center of a whole worldview of creative Catholics that span the globe in this period. And it wasn't exactly a group of Catholic friends. You know, some of them really knew each other, but it was instead spiritual friendship was a shared worldview, central to a global Catholic community in the mid-20th century. And attending to the centrality of friendship animates the kind of inner life of an incredibly creative period in Catholicism, pointing to the emotions that underlie a really unique moment in the history of the church. Religiously meaningful friendships took place face to face, you know, like we would have, like the way that we consider friends, but also friendship was a way people talked about the remembered dead, people remembering friends through prayer, you know, non-ordinary modes of consciousness, memory, imagination. To explain the sensibilities these men and women felt among friends, often they reached for images of fire. Holy friends, they said, burn, light, or kindle other souls with their inner flame. So this is, this is just a picture of many of the people in my book about kindred spirits. Some of them are somewhat well known, like some of you may have heard the name Simone Weil, who's a near Catholic, Jacques Maritain, Raïssa Maritain, but others are people that I've uncovered in my research. And many of them were from all over the world, but had some connection to Paris. And Paris was a real epicenter of theological creativity. And I learned that these people all made contact either with one another or this shared worldview about spiritual friendship, because all of these people lived through what some people have called the 20th century, the century of extremity, warfare, genocide, dictatorships, violence, which created mass exiles and refugees around the world. And throughout this wartime in the 20th century, many people left their homelands for safer parts of the world, where these displaced people came in contact with one another, shared a worldview, learned one another. And France in particular, Paris, before World War II, when then Paris was unsafe as well, but Paris had an outsized role in welcoming exiles and refugees in the interwar period and bringing lots of different kinds of people together. So immigrants, although we often think of that as like a new problem, immigrants from all over the world came to Paris fleeing violence in the early part of the 20th century, and every single figure that I wrote about had some connection to Paris. France, in the mid-1920s, France received more immigrants than any other country in the industrialized world. 3 million foreigners resided in France in 1930. And interwar Paris, as Langston Hughes put it, was packed with the seeking wandering ones from all over the world. Raïssa Maritain was originally Jewish. She later converted to Catholicism. She was in Paris from Russia. People there were from Latin America, from even the Arabic world, North Africa. And there was many different experiences these people had of being in exile from the war, being a refugee. But for every single Catholic, above all, friendship is what offered a kind of form of belonging when their nations were separated, many families, or the nations were crumbling, families were separated. In the context of massive exile, migration, war, friendships anchored their world and kept alive a sense of the transcendent in a very dark period in global history. Gabriela Mistral, a Chilean poet, a Benedictine oblate, often wrote about her spiritual need to hear from her friends while she was in exile. She said, "Always the best thing in my life comes from friends who are dispersed throughout the world." Another writer described her friend Raïssa Maritain and said, "To know her life, you have to understand her religious, her spiritual feeling for friendship." And friendship didn't teach one another about God or faith, but I think it was the experience of friendship that enacted, cultivated, sustained a belief in God. The language of friendship was also the central metaphor for Catholic activist organizations of this period in the years leading up to Vatican II. And many of these organizations and people who founded them had a big role to play at Vatican II. So you can see, and this is probably too small print, but some of these are in Spanish, some are French, some are in English, but they're organizations of solidarity that use the language of friendship, like amitié, amistad, amigos, friendship. So one of the amitié judéo-chrétienne, Jewish Christian friendship, was founded to help combat anti-Semitism during World War II in France. There was an interracial black and white experimental house. It started in Harlem in the late 1930s called Friendship House. These are all primarily, Catholic activist organizations that reach for the language or the metaphor of friendship to try to describe the work of solidarity that they're doing. And within these organizations, there was often a debate. Like, some people thought, hey, the friendship is the end goal, like at that interracial friendship house. Like, as long as black and whites are friends with one another, that's the goal. And some people would say, no, that can't be the goal. The friendship is just the starting place where we start as friends, and then together we go on to make changes in our society. So sometimes there was a lot of debate about, is it the friendship that's changing the world, or is the friendship the beginning to do something else that's going to change the world? So there was a lot of debates about what this meant. But for everybody, friendship was the central metaphor. And of course, a couple different, distinctive features I'd like to point out about this is that the category of friendship is like eating or walking or raising kids. It's a universal thing. All cultures have friendships. And even there's beautiful other religious cultures. Some of the most beautiful writing about friendship are Jewish writers. Hannah Arendt, Jacques Derrida have written about friendship. But there's what I think is interesting is, like, what is uniquely Catholic about this model of spiritual friendship. And I think most of all of these people were connected in some way with a religious order. They were associates or oblates of religious orders. And many of them studied and found inspiration from medieval texts about spiritual friendship, where monks and nuns would talk about the importance, or even sometimes the risk, but the importance of finding relationships that are spiritually very powerful outside of the nuclear family, not your kids or your husband and wife, but you have these other, intense modes of affiliation. So all these 20th century Catholics were really interested in these books, inspired by these monastic books about spiritual friendship. And the 20th century people, just like the monks and nuns, went beyond the domestic sphere to consider the spiritual, political, social rewards that might be found in a circle of friends. And the medieval and the monastic, this is somebody who's in 2 chapters of my Kindred Spirits book. The medieval and monastic inspiration, you can see it in some of the more unusual, I think to contemporary American ears, unusual ways they thought about friendship that I just found really interesting. So Marie Magdalene Davy is one of the few women in this context of early mid-20th century France who worked alongside a lot of the Jesuit theologians who were at Vatican II. She was a scholar of Cistercian monasticism, and she was active in the underground resistance against Nazism, helped Jews safely get out of Europe, and friendship was crucial. She never married or had children, but she was a layperson, and she said, "When it comes to blood, I choose friends." But weirdly, I went to her archive in France. All of the pictures I have of her, she's alone, smoking, with her books. She also wrote really intensely on this need for solitude. She said, "Solitude is my teacher. I married solitude as others have taken a companion." And when she describes friendship, she, I think, is often talking about a kind of inner spiritual bond that she felt with the medieval monks and nuns that she wrote about as scholars. So she talked about people like Bernard of Clairvaux and the authors that she studied as her inner friends, and that she was kind of talking about what Peter Brown describes early Christianity, their devotion to saints, as invisible friendship. She describes these mystical theologians as her friends. And I think that when she's talking about both inner friendship and this dialectic of the importance of solitude and friendship, all of that comes from kind of Cistercian monastic spirituality. Really different, unusual ways of thinking about friendships. She also created a kind of a post-war international peace house dedicated in honor of memory of her late friend Simone Weil, called Maison Simone Weil, which is, I think a really interesting, that's another interesting experiment. What she talks about, this deep love of belonging to a community of friends, and a sometimes deep exhaustion with belonging that drives us towards solitude. That both of those are really crucial on a pathway to God. Again, this comes from the monastic literature she was immersed in. And I'd say this world of spiritual friendship that I was been immersed in for many years for my research, I think there's a lot of it that really stands in sharp contrast to many of the ways that we think about friendship today. So there's a contemporary writer who I love, Maria Popsova, and she's written about what she calls the commodification of the word friend in our culture. She says that today we might call friends peers with whom we might have a professional connection, someone with whom we might have shared interests, we have fun together. Nothing wrong with any of that, but what I'm describing, the friendships that I found, were very different than that. They were much, much deeper. And I think one of the things that I saw when I read all the letters that friends wrote to one another, people wrote books about their friends, so there's just a huge archive of friendship, that I came to know that these people were totally willing to share significant fears and vulnerabilities, their anguish, their disappointments. Friendship was the sharing of intimate knowledge of another person's interior life, often the most vulnerable and hidden parts of one's life to a friend. These bonds I came across in letters, eulogies, journal writing. I saw true friends really reveal themselves, stripped down from their perfective self, the best mood self, the fun self, the happy self, to reveal something more vulnerable, imperfect, and trusting that sharing that vulnerability did not diminish friends' affection for one another. It was the grounds of the bond itself. And let me just show you a quick little example of this. This is a letter that I found in the archive between Jacques Maritain, and he wrote a correspondence to his friend, the Jewish community organizer Saul Alinsky in 1947, after he heard about the tragic drowning accident, actually in Lake Michigan. Saul Alinsky's wife drowned in Lake Michigan. And the correspondence of these two men, that I think in our culture, it's like we have this more masculine understandings of you kind of tough it up and hold it in. And it's the most loving, beautiful correspondence of compassion. Jacques wrote to Saul Alinsky, "My heart is full of your distress and agony. What is it my love capable of unless suffering with you? Everything human is powerless in the face of such a tragedy. There is no help on earth. You cannot be consoled. Every fiber of happiness in your body has been struck by lightning." And he replied, "Jacques, dear, I wept over your letter. It has been placed in a special folder where I can always look at it. I want my children to know it. To Jacques Maritain, that rare person who not only professes Christianity, but whose heart is filled with it. To know Jacques Maritain is to know a richness and a spiritual experience that makes life even more glorious." And I saw many letters in which friends, and not just women, but men and men and men and women, being very, very tender with each other, vulnerable, kind of releasing their shattered or needy selves into the trust and shelter of another person. And some of the other really distinctive Catholic kind of Catholic valences of spiritual friendship included friends with one another marking anniversaries of special deaths, visiting gravestones to one another, acknowledging loss together in the context of friendship, commemorating in the context of friendship the shadow side of life. This was the edifice out of the bonds of so many friendship that I researched. That was what was built. And it struck me, how different it is of, the ways that we can present ourselves like virtually with friends, where we often present our best selves, our puffed up selves to one another. And of course we can think of like Instagram and things, but even I know like my students at Fordham, there's so much pressure to seem like they're perfect, the perfect body, the perfect grades. It's like, that is almost so anti-friendship. You can't really have real friendship with you if you don't present a vulnerable, imperfect self. So that was something. I think that really struck me, that these friends were companions in the shadows of life. The other thing that this is just back to the picture of the group, is how central friendship was to the practice of making art and creativity. So all of these people were theologians, poets, artists, writers, and in looking at their archive, all of them had doubts about their writing, were too busy to get the book done, thought they could never do it, nobody would want to read what I did, all full of self-doubts. But the only way they got things done was their friends encouraging. "Yes, you can say no to that invitation. You can do it. I can't wait to read it. Send it to me first." I mean, friendship was the engine that fueled all of the artistic output from this incredibly creative period in Catholic history. So when we kind of want to think about how to change our culture to become more creative, to have good art, good theology, all that, I think friendship is the bedrock out of which that stuff flows, because we're also full often of self-doubts. Okay, and then I would say, and then another couple little things. So one of the things that struck me as kind of weird, I think, about this world that I have come to think of quite a bit is the monastic inspiration that fueled a lot of this practice of spiritual friendship meant that a lot of their writing was very sensual to one another, even erotic, letters between men and women, men and men, women and women. There was a deep kind of erotic, sensual kind of energy to this whole friendship world, in a way that when I teach it to my students, they would all say like, "Oh, really? They just wanted to be friends." I think they were all kind of after a little something else. That it sounded like there was just passionate love. And so what to think of that? Like, is it that these people really just all wanted to be having sex with each other? And then instead I found this intense, kind of almost like passionate, like, "I love you, I think about you, I dream about you." But they really were just friends. I mean, and even Jacques and Raïssa Maritain were married to one another, but they had a vow of celibacy in their marriage. So, that I thought, well, what is going on with all of that? So I tried to face that question very, very honestly in my research. And what I came down to was this, that I don't know for sure what the private sexual practices were of most of these people, but they were lay people, most of them. They didn't have the prohibitions against sex that many of them did, that many of the clergy did. But they were private about their sex life. And I think from what I can see that most of them really were just friends. And I think that it says something about the poverty of our contemporary imagination that can't imagine adult love or adult intimacy in any terms that aren't sexual. It's almost our worldview that would look at a love letter between, two good friends, men and women, like Alinsky and Jacques Maritain, or there's so many. I mean, I didn't even show, my book has a lot more of the erotic ones, and that you only imagine sex is the only truth there is to tell about that. I think that really narrows it. That's a really narrow interpretation of the wide varieties of ways we see what adult love can look like. So I ultimately, described this as a kind of a sensual, erotic world that wasn't necessarily sexual. And I know I kind of walk a fine line. I don't want to act like actual sex is like this locked garden, like, we can't even discuss it. But they really didn't, it wasn't in the archive. They didn't, and I kind of just wanted to let that be, a little bit. But I absolutely don't think that sex is like how to, how we need to translate all of that stuff. And I would say, that ultimately, to reduce this desire of a kind of familiar trope of Catholic repression of sexuality, it really, I think, kind of disregards, narrows this, I would say. And I think that ultimately the love in these friendships kind of overflow, in a sense, from the question of sex. And again, I think that speaks to our own time and our culture. The platonic love is often pitted against the romantic. And I think that these friendships show something a little more complicated than that, that even the romantic can be a capacious category that might not mean actually sex. These friendships point to something, complex, capacious, and I think very transcendent. There was much more to it than that. And so now that I've shown you some of the details on this world and my interpretation of it, I want to zoom out for my last bit of time here. And are we doing okay with time? Okay, yeah. I last time and make some more explicit connections, although hopefully thinking about friendship, we all have experiences with friendship. You might be thinking of connections to our own time. I'll just say some things that are explicit that I think of how this might speak to our own moment. I say Catholics have always been considered more communal-minded as opposed to Protestant or secular American individualism. Catholics are seen to have church, institutions, commitments to the common good, but I found that this Catholic communal sensibility was often more intimate, more interpersonal. Spiritual friendship was not individualistic, certainly, but it was really different than just belonging to a church, right? It was committed to belonging in a really, really intimate way, and it helps us see forms of Catholic community that are maybe slightly different from the institutional church or parish as the kind of main locus of Catholic connection. So I just think that seems like something kind of interesting. And that, I would say, speaks to our own time. And I mentioned this in the introduction, but just the spring of last year, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, published an advisory paper that's really interesting that you can get online that he called Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. And he writes that in recent years, about 1 in 2 adults in America reported experiencing loneliness. And across age groups, people are spending less and less time with one another in person than just in previous years, of course, all exacerbated during COVID. And the advisory reported that the most pronounced is young people, ages 15 to 24, and I have a 15-year-old daughter, so this, I think about this quite a lot, that they reported last year the vast majority of people in that age bracket have 70% less FaceTime social interaction with their friends than they did 2 decades ago. So, and loneliness is what he says in this advisory, is much more than just a bad feeling that you have. It harms both individual and societal health, right? So he's the Surgeon General. And he says that loneliness is associated with, of course, mental health issues, depression, anxiety, but also dementia, premature death, cardiovascular disease. That the impact of being socially disconnected, he argues, is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. So being lonely is an even greater health risk than obesity, physical inactivity. And he says that we are really called to build a movement to mend the social fabric of our nation. But I really like that he says it's not an individual goal to get us more connected. It's not just like, open your heart to your friend. I mean, there's a role that we can all play as individuals, but he's interested in kind of helping our society, workplace, integrate activities for communal building, thinking about architecture as opportunities for communal building, public parks, and so forth like that. And I think that there's, all of these ways to build a culture that's less lonely. And I think one of the great things about living in a faith tradition like Catholicism is that we all have a connection to another way of being in the world. While loneliness is an epidemic growing in the U.S., we have access to a tradition that totally points to another way. These long traditions of friendships, I think, point to another way. And I'll just briefly just show you one example of something that kind of intrigued me. This is another book that I just wrote that just came out last month called Mutuality in Our Barrio, and it's about the history of the Little Sisters of the Assumption nuns in East Harlem. And mutuality is not the same word as spiritual friendship, but it's a kind of relational word, and that is their kind of orientation for all of their work they do serving the poor in East Harlem. And one of the, this is the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. I guess I had that slide out of order. But one of the projects that they have done that I think is so replicable and so Catholic and so connected to spiritual friendship is this program that there's an image on the far left of called the Grandmother Program, that they serve immigrant mothers who recently crossed the border, made their way to East Harlem, and have very few social ties. They have all their extended family are in Mexico or elsewhere in the world. And they know that human relationships are key to health, like the Surgeon General now is saying, and they're central to spiritual life and everything. So what the sisters did is find retired Spanish-speaking grandmas that live in East Harlem and match them with a low-income mother or family to serve as a local abuela. And they're kind of trying to recreate the extended family patterns. And it's not exactly spiritual friendship, but it's certainly not exactly nuclear family. I mean, they're really creating these bonds of intimacy that are outside, the nuclear family of blood. And it's also outside the parish model. It's just trying to kind of lift up and cultivate, bonds of intense formation and connection. And these grandmothers and abuelas that are assigned to families would often stay like 10, 15, 20 years. And would completely make a huge impact in the lives of these mothers and the kids who were raised. And then often when these retired abuelas got much older and sicker, they would get help just in the same way a regular grandma. But not everybody, especially in New York City, has actual grandmas there. But I think that just seems like a really other, like beyond just the interpersonal, more structural, societal, and a deeply, deeply Catholic way of thinking about the centrality of human intimacy and human connection and social cohesion for making the world a better place. And yes, and I would say, and so the final thing, I'll leave it at that slide, is this vision of mutuality, spiritual friendship, all of that helps, I think, open up our imaginations for other models, more capacious, larger models of Catholic love beyond just the nuclear family. And it offers a real critique and alternative to widespread American ideals like rugged individualism or presenting just your best, your best self, like good vibes only, to other people. Or this assumption that we're better left off alone, keep our insecurities and vulnerabilities hidden. But I think what's also great is the people that I've shared with you, they don't just critique those, but they, with their own life, enact a living, breathing alternative. It's a chosen closeness, an expanded understanding of human belonging and intimacy, even an alternative archive of Catholic love. And a resuscitation of spiritual friendships might provide inspiration for those who dare to imagine the possibilities that might emerge from a larger, more expansive sense of the bonds of affection that make us whole. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and I think we have time for a few questions.
I've got it.
Okay. When I'm listening to what you're saying about friendship, I'm wondering if, when we're talking about this, what we talk about now more currently as being your authentic self, that if I put those two things together, if you want to form deeper friendships, then you need to create spaces for and with each other where people feel comfortable being their authentic self. Because it's hard for us, I think, to think about any kind of social intimacy when what we believe about ourselves is that we have this image and this role, and that's what we're to be about being, instead of being ourselves as God created us to be in the fullness of our humanity with each other. Is that?
Yes, I think that's a totally beautiful restatement and, using different language, but absolutely that's what I'm seeing. That's what these people, this world of spiritual friendship was about, sharing the authentic self, and I think that meant, so many of the letters that I found were brokenness, insecurity, almost like handing their own vulnerable self over to a loved one and then feeling affirmed, consoled, and that letter would come back, affirmed, consoled, and then you're able keep going. So I think, is that?
Yeah, so then my question to you is, taking what you've learned from our past, do you have some advice as to how we can really start to practice being our authentic self, as contradictory as that sounds? What do we need to do to get there through all of this muck?
Yeah, I think that's really great. A great question. So I think a couple things I would say is the pressure for younger people to be really perfect. So some of you might have nieces, nephews, grandkids. It is a totally different world than how you grew up and I grew up. But the pressure to have the perfect body, get the all A's, take the APs, the level of depression and anxiety among my college students, it's crazy. But they all say that it comes from this pressure for perfectionism. And I think the more we can say to our kids, our teens in our life, hey, it's okay. Don't take that 6th AP class. And hey, you didn't make the varsity team. Hey, I didn't either. I did something at Fordham called a failabration, where we celebrated our failures. I invited faculty to show, hey, rejected book, rejected grant, bad grade, and we just, all shared all of our stuff, because these people think, oh my God, I didn't get the internship. It's like, that's part of life, but there's something about our culture that right now doesn't acknowledge all of that. Like, who cares? You missed it. You missed the shot. There's just a hamster wheel of perfection. And that we all know young people in our life and can help move the needle, I think. So that's a big thing. And then the second thing, any leadership role that you're ever in a friend group or a book club or anything, I think a model of leadership is showing your own vulnerabilities, and that when one person can do that, hey, I didn't finish this book, I didn't have time, this was a disaster, or, things going on with your family, that can be contagious, and I know that even those of us who might, express some of their faith with charity works and so forth, that I know that when I was volunteering, and I still am, I'm on the board of this organization, that I only really started to become real friends with the people in East Harlem, you know, people from different races, classes, even the elderly sisters, when I started to be vulnerable and share, you know, about a health issue in my own family. But you can't really have authentic relationships and show your real self if you're always the helper. You're come in to help. The performer, the helper, so you have to be willing, you know, to kind of share. And so I only really had deep friendships once I started to share about this health issue, you know, that was in my family, instead of just be like, Dr. Moore coming in to help. Like that doesn't create friendships. So those are some little tactics. But all of you, you know, are from a time period, and I kind of am too, where it wasn't such the pressure for perfectionism and good vibes only, and I got it all together. So there was pressure too. Oh yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yes. Exactly. And I think that working with young people, it is like shocking how widespread that kind of oh yeah. More, I mean, I didn't feel that as much in Michigan, and I was like rural Michigan, just not even, I look at pictures, I'm like, I'm surprised I ever had a boyfriend. I mean, I didn't feel that. Maybe there's been moments where, you know, female perfectionism has been more prominent than others, but right now, wow. Yeah, thank you. That was such a great question. It's it's yep, it's this. This is the Surgeon General's advisory on the healing effects of social connection and community, our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. It's a report, and you can get it on Google. Like if you just Google that, it's a PDF. And I think we all should read it, because it also has ideas of things we can do in families, in our cities, and it's pretty amazing, the data, you know, on this stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking, you're talking about loneliness.
I'm not seeing. Oh, there. Okay. Yes.
Loneliness, like a genuine loneliness, would lead to mysticism. And you think the mystics, were they in connection with all people? You know, so those kind of friendships, probably they might be unknown. The friendships here are more kind of the beginning friendships. But I was just wondering if the mystics they were connected with all of humanity, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I teach a lot of the mysticism courses at Fordham. And, you know, a lot of the mystics required something very solitary, you know, about their prayer lives, their writing. And I do think there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. You know, solitude to me is a kind of a chosen sequestering. But I think, you know, the mystics that I know some things about, like Teresa of Avila, did have also some close companions, like John of the Cross, that it would be hard to imagine a healthy spiritual life totally devoid of human relationality. I think that they were drawn into periods of solitude and seclusion, and that is really different from feeling lonely. You know, like last night, me staying at the Ursuline Mother House in the Pilgrims, I was so happy for my solitude. Oh my gosh, yeah. So, yeah, solitude is like a huge gift, you know. But I think, yeah, maybe as a culture, we need to talk a little bit more about the solitude of being comfortable with yourself and being alone and happy, towards feeling really anxious and alone and disconnected from everybody. Yeah.
It's my turn, Ann. Thank you. I think that we might all agree that there's a lot of division and polarization in our current culture. And I'm wondering if in your research, particularly political, in your research, if you see any hope or advice for navigating those conflicts, or hope for even healing friendships? I know I've seen friendships and family members just destroyed over politics.
Mm-hmm.
In your research, have you seen anything that you could offer hope?
Yes, I can. I mean, I haven't shared this publicly because it just happened this year. This is more my experience as a teacher because, at Fordham, the political polarization is so intense on our campus too. Absolutely. Gaza, the election coming up. I'm terrified of the election coming up and what that's the chilling effect, the polarization. But I did an experiment this year about abortion, which I never have taught about abortion. It's like stay away from these like really controversial issues. But I thought if we can't at a university talk in a calm, generous way about our most difficult issues, literally where would we do that? So we did this thing where we very much planned it, and I had all the students in the class write down on a Post-it note, what would make it very hard for you to show up honestly and contribute to a discussion about abortion, and put it on a Post-it note and put it on the wall. And we all looked at the wall, all the different things people were scared of. I'm scared I'm a man can't say anything. I'm scared I'm going to be, dismissed as women hating, and I'm just trying to live out my parents' values. I have had an abortion. Like all these things that it was just, we kind of just spent a day and then we kind of did some ground rules. Okay, so given that we know people that have had abortions aren't like out there, they're in the room, and given that there's men in the room really nervous to speak, let's all agree, men can contribute to this conversation, and we can't do generalizations about the pro-life or about, the pro-choice out there. They're all in the room, and we together created some ground rules. And then we just read some really interesting readings about the experiences of working in a pregnancy shelter, and even very devout Christian women who have terminated pregnancies and a lot of pro-life stuff. And we had small groups and just respond to the readings. And they thought I was going to make them do a debate. I would never. We don't need a debate, And I said, and I didn't even share my view, and I didn't even ask people to share their own personal view, but they went in small groups after we did the exercise of sharing our feelings to the ground, small groups, and they shared, where did you get your ideas about abortion growing up? Where did you get your ideas? And then, is there one thing in the opposite, if you're pro-life, what is pro-choice, or pro-choice, pro-life, that you find attractive? Is there something that compels you about the other side? Is there something about your side that gives you doubt, that you're worried? And just to share, kind of their experience. And the truth is that the undergrads knew so little. It's almost like they're expected to debate and engage where they had never really had a conversation about it. They've taught what the teaching is, from the church, but they just to really read and think and discuss and sit with the complexity, and just kind of listen and talk about their own experience or their own experience to the readings. It was really a transformative experience. And so I think in universities, like, just really laying the groundwork, for these very curated conversations where people, can not so much debate or take a side, but kind of sit with the complexity, of an issue. That I found that really hopeful. And the students were amazing. They were so smart, so smart. And I had a grad version and an undergrad. In the grad, several Jesuit priests who were scholastics in training, people who were the pro-life bus leaders from Notre Dame undergrad. So everything from that to women who've terminated pregnancy. We had really the spectrum, but they were all great, and I just thought, now we need more of that, in this country. But I think that just has to happen at a grassroots level. That has to happen in person, grassroots, small community by small community. And they were so happy to get off their phones, and and I said no one can tweet about anything that happens in here, so that was a nice thing too, like very safe space. Yeah. But thank you.
Brenna, we're referring to mystics and mysticism, and it's always in the past tense. I would assume we have present-day mystics, but is one officially deemed a mystic, when they have passed on and their writings and letters are unveiled? I can't think of any contemporary people that would come to my mind, but maybe yours.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the class I teach on mysticism, you know, you could also, that sometimes that word sounds so esoteric and it's something strange, but, you know, kind of the writings that are about the experiential, the spiritual experience, you know, spiritual experience. And I think that we don't have access to people's spiritual experience, but the writings, you know, so it's like we just have access to the writers who describe their experience. And, you know, I'm trying to think of contemporary people, but there's certainly, like, in this period that I talked about, there were many people that we would today, you know, consider mystical writers, like Simone Weil or Thomas Merton. You know, there was like a renaissance of mystical writings in that period. But in terms of very contemporary, I mean, one of the sisters, this is Sister Margaret Leonard, a little sister of the Assumption nun, really old, just moved into a nursing home outside of Boston. And her writing, she has a couple honorary doctorates. She's written a lot about poverty and social justice, but she has beautiful spiritual writings. That she has a essay called Disciples in the Shadow of God, and she, I think, is kind of a mystic and a spiritual writer, you know, but when she dies, it might become more clear and people are going to probably write about her. But I think that they're often, you know, not too showy, you know, kind of make quiet. So it sometimes can take a while and someone else to discover their writings and publish them and translate them and make them accessible to us as gifts.
We are out of time.
But I'm not rushing. If you want, you can.
Catch her after.
Yes, I'm not rushing.
We
can
try
chat
to be
after.
very respectful of the people that may have to get back to work or something like that. But Brenna, you'll stay for a few extra minutes?
Yeah.
So there you go. So Brenna will stay for you.
Yes.
But thank you so much, Brenna. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.